United Nations Global Compact presents Listen Up, a podcast about making better choices for a sustainable future. So, why don't you just grab a seat and
listen up.
Listen up.
Listen up.
Listen up.
Hey, listen up.
Greetings from the United Nations Global Compact in New York. I'm Dan Thomas, and you're listening to Listen Up, a podcast series on the young business leaders driving change in their companies in order to create a more sustainable world. Who says profit and purpose can't go hand in hand? Today, I'm talking to Dylan McNeill, Global Director for Supplier Sustainability at Royal Philips, the Dutch health technology company. Now, I first met Dylan when he came to visit us at the UN Private Sector Forum in New York a couple of years ago, after being selected as one of our 10 young SDG pioneers. Dylan, it's really nice to see you again.
Yeah, likewise.
You're a successful sustainability leader in your mid-30s now, but tell us a bit about your early life. Was your interest in creating a more sustainable planet inspired by your childhood, or did that inspiration come later?
Yeah, so if I look at my studies, they were focused on sustainability, but when I started to work, it was actually in IT versus in the sustainability domain. If I go all the way back to my childhood, it has always been a passion of mine. My dad is originally from Scotland. I spent a big portion of my childhood holidays in Scotland, for instance, walking in the mountains, spending time in nature. And one of the key lessons that my parents always try to teach me is try to leave your environment in a better state than what you found it in. And so whenever we would go on walks, we would take a bag with us and we would pick up all the waste that we would come across during the trails. And so that is a lesson that has stuck and that I always try to also apply and integrate in my future career.
That's great. So you started working in IT, as you said. How did you end up making that switch to sustainability?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, originally my education already focused on sustainability, but technology has always been something I'm highly interested in. As a kid, I loved taking apart electrical appliances with the intent to then put it back together again once I understood how it worked. I have to admit, sometimes the whole making it work again part was less successful than the taking apart part. But starting my career in IT, it gave me the opportunity to learn a lot at a rapid pace because it was a relatively new domain for me. And I still see a lot of benefits from that period that I can now apply to program management in the space of sustainability by, for instance, trying to apply systems and process thinking to some of the challenges that I come across. About the transition, at the time I was working for a big consulting company that luckily in-house also had a sustainability department. I actually started with a bit of a side gig where I would focus next to my day job, let's say, on trying to make the company itself more sustainable and embrace CSR practices. And through that, I was able to build a network with people that had their full-time jobs around sustainability and sustainability consulting. And through that network, I was actually able to then make the internal transition before I made my move over to Philips.
What kind of things does a sustainability professional do or think about every day at work?
At work, it is mostly about trying to drive change, of course, working with other people, engaging different types of stakeholders to try to make an impact as much as possible.
An impact on what, and how does that come about?
Yeah, so if I look at my own job, I have a number of programs that I focus on. Some focus especially on the social situation in our supply chain, and others, for instance, on the environmental impact from our supply chain. And so it is then about making a positive impact by having, for instance, our suppliers tackle social inequality that might be present in the chain or lower their own impact when it comes to their environmental input. So doing the same with less, simply by becoming more energy efficient, for instance. And so the impact that I try to make is either on people that I engage with to get them to embrace certain ideas, embrace certain business cases that could really help them in achieving some of those goals or working on those goals myself, actually.
So Dylan, you've been helping Royal Philips guide your suppliers towards sustainable solutions that reduce environmental impact in areas from handling hazardous waste to preventing fires. Please tell us a bit about the work that you're doing at Philips. What change are you driving? How are you helping the company to become more sustainable?
Yeah, so it goes a little bit back to what I was saying before, that the biggest thing that we do differently is how we engage on topics like environmental pollution, health and safety at the work environment, labor conditions that are being offered. We think that there's a clear business case behind making changes there, applying continuous improvement, and taking just steps in further maturing as an organization. That pays itself back, whether it's from resource efficiency, where resources cost money. So if you find a way to handle them better with less waste, there's an impact on the cost, a positive impact, to having more employee engagement because they feel safer in their work environment, because they feel respected by their employer. So that, for instance, turnover goes down, attraction of high talents becomes easier. We think there's a lot of supporting evidence already for all these things. It's really just making the calculation and helping suppliers see that, and then also helping them with realizing the business case behind that by employing best practices, by offering them a lot of knowledge that we've built over a number of decades with us focusing on this stuff, so that they can basically go through that journey that we've been going through for a very long time in a relatively short period.
So give us an example. What kind of products or processes are these guys working on? And how does the work that you're doing make a real sort of tangible benefit to their work?
Yeah, so for instance, a lot of our suppliers operate in a manufacturing context. So there are factories where they create components that end up in our products. And it could be that there are unsafe situations at work and that they don't really see the correlation between having safety incidents from happening to people having a resistance to go to their environments, and maybe continuously are looking for alternative options. So by lowering, for instance, injuries from occurring, you see also that employee engagement goes up. And obviously there is a very big ethical point of it, where people can just continue to work because they're not dropping out because of those injuries. And so what we then could do is, by coming in, supporting them in developing a management system approach, where they can integrate elements of safety in their day-to-day operations without completely overhauling everything, but simply adding that lens to how they look at the factory environment, and thereby being able to spot unsafe working conditions a lot more quickly to prevent actually an injury from even occurring, versus just having to remediate it once an injury has occurred.
And is it hard to persuade managers in your supply chains to make these changes? Are they receptive to these kinds of ideas?
In our experience, they're very receptive. So as an industry, we're coming from this system that is really focused on compliance. So the tech industry has focused on sustainability in the supply chain for quite a long time. But the role that they took in the past is that of a sustainability police officer. And what we are trying to be is a lot more a sustainability doctor. So before, people would get slapped on the wrist if they didn't fully comply with the code of conduct. We tried to support them to get to a certain situation that it's much easier for them to fully follow the norms laid out in that code of conduct, because there's a clear benefit for them if they do.
And this is a benefit in terms of a happier workforce, a safer workforce, less injuries, and also the bottom line.
Also the bottom line. So, for instance, in the environmental space, obviously, if you're able to do more with the same energy, that means that there's lower cost associated to it. If you look at happier employees, as you mentioned, or less injuries from occurring, just the cost of constantly having to attract new people is quite high. They need to be onboarded, they need to be trained, their output initially is lower, there are more quality concerns with maybe some of the products if they're just starting as an engineer, and so keeping the same people around actually pays itself back very quickly.
And so the Global Compact, we're obviously driving companies to help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Are those goals something that you think about at Royal Philips? How does this work connect to the SDGs?
Yeah, very much. So us as an organization, we see three of the Sustainable Development Goals most strongly linked to our company purpose. I think that the biggest one where the link is easiest to understand is health and well-being for all. So SDG number 3. And that fits, of course, one-on-one with being a health technology company. If we then look at what we're doing in the supply chain, I think they touch on almost all of the Sustainable Development Goals in one way or the other, simply because of the depth and the broadness of the code of conduct that we are rolling out and that we're supporting our suppliers on.
Tell us about, have you had the opportunity to visit some of these supply chains, these factories, to meet the workers, their families? Tell me a bit about what you've seen, really on the ground in some of these countries. Where have you been and what are people telling you?
Yeah, so the visits that I've made have mostly been to China, where every time I would go there, I would visit a number of factories and a number of suppliers indeed. And what I see is that they're very eager and very hungry to learn from us and to learn from the best practices that we've been developing over the years, with an audit, which is a typical way of engaging that most of the industry is still using to try to make suppliers embrace, for instance, a set of norms. You see that there's a lot of hesitance. They just want to get through it as quickly as possible because it's really extrinsically motivated, where there's this external force that is telling you, do this, comply, or else. With us, there's a lot more them asking us questions. I was actually shown a part of the building at one of the suppliers where they said, normally we don't really like to go to this part of the building. If we have the opportunity, we skip it altogether when we do a tour, simply because we know that it's not really perfect in how we've organized it, but we also don't really know what the best practices are and how to go best about that. Do you have any examples for us that we can learn from? And so, yeah, you see that the relationship that we're having with those suppliers, because we're engaging with them in a very different way, where there's not really a threat of punishment, there's more an incentive that they're going to get recognized if they make continuous steps to improve themselves, is very welcomed.
So it sounds like more of a partnership than a kind of parental-child relationship.
Yeah, I think that's a spot-on analogy indeed.
Tell us about some of the workers that you've met. You must have met some of the people who work in these supply chains, in factories, making electronics and that kind of thing. How does it change their lives? How does it affect their lives, their families, in a place like China or other places you've visited?
Yeah, so if we look really at the individual, they all of a sudden are going to a workplace where, for instance, protective equipment is more readily available. They're explained a lot more what the impact might be if they're not using it properly. They can experience better remuneration, where, for instance, every overtime hour is actually paid out against a premium cost that maybe was originally agreed on, where in some countries it is very common practice to agree on a certain amount because it is legally mandated. But then when you see your salary slip, it's not all there. And so obviously that puts a lot of pressure on the employer-employee relationship, and you see turnover being extremely high in those types of situations, until they then come to a supplier where that supplier also sees the return on investment for lowering the turnover by paying out the commitments that they've made to these employees, and all of a sudden you see their spending power going up, reaching living wage standards, so that it's not only that they can stay afloat, but they're also prepared more for any incidentals, and their dependents can also have a more fruitful life, let's say, because of that.
Have you had a chance to sit down and have a lunch or a conversation with any of the managers or the workers in these supply chains? What are they telling you?
Yeah, not me personally, but some of my colleagues work a lot more in the factory environment. And you see there that there's been quite a shift, that initially when we explained this new way of engaging, there was quite some hesitance. They thought, okay, is this just a trick where you tell us that we can trust you, but then as soon as we open up the kimono, let's say, you're just going to punish us and you're going to have this impact our business relationship? Or is this really true that you're here to help us and support us in taking gradual steps?
It sounds like trust is very important.
Extremely important, yeah.
And tell me about some of the obstacles you've faced in this career of yours, driving change. What kind of obstacles have you faced? How have you overcome those?
Yeah, so one of the internal obstacles maybe that I've had at the start of my career is that I sometimes found it very difficult to have to repeat my messages. I didn't want to come across as a broken record. Instead figured that arguments would click instantly to the hearers in the same way that they clicked in my head, let's say. And now I have a bit of a better understanding of how neuroplasticity works. I understand better the mere exposure effect, which is a psychological phenomenon where if people hear something a few times, it starts to feel familiar and it starts to maybe sound less ridiculous than the first time that they heard an idea that is a little bit out of the box. And sometimes having a little bit of a repeat in your messages is extremely important if you want people to radically change.
Are you worried about the future of the planet as a young business leader?
Yes and no. I try to not focus on problems if I'm not able to do anything about the problem. And so, of course, there are a lot of big problems, and I try to contribute to those as much as possible. I think there is really a strong need to make change, though. But it's not that it consumes me to the level that it's debilitating. It is more that it gives me energy because I want to work on helping resolve some of the issues.
So now it's time to come on to our rapid fire round. And if you could answer these questions in 60 seconds or less, Dylan, what kind of car do you drive?
I drive a very boring Honda Civic hybrid from 2009. But as a proper person from the Netherlands, I have not one, but two bicycles as well to switch things up when the car stays in the garage.
What's your most embarrassing, most unsustainable secret, your guilty pleasure?
I love the barbecue. I bought this big green egg and I absolutely love it, but it is working on charcoal, which is, of course, absolutely not sustainable. The quality of the product itself, it's made very sustainably and it's excellent for vegetables. It doesn't have to be meat or anything like that, but it gives me a lot of joy when I'm not working.
Have you ever hugged a tree?
I have. It is not something that I do on a daily basis, but I have read a very interesting study the other day that says hugging trees actually releases a lot of dopamine and serotonin. So if you're having a bad day, if you're seeing the blues, then science is actually saying hug a tree, it will make you feel better.
What do you have to say to young people thinking about a career in sustainability? What's your advice to how to pursue that career path?
So to pursue that career path is find sponsors, I would say. If you're not already working in the field of sustainability but want to transition to it, reach out to some people that are working in sustainability. Or I think generally speaking, I think they should be rather approachable and friendly. And so if somebody reaches out with a keen interest in sustainability, then my experience, at least from the colleagues and the other people that I've come across during my career, is that they're then very willing to lend a hand and share information and share their journey. And there's a lot of lessons, of course, that you can then try to incorporate in your own life.
Well, great. So it's my pleasure to thank you, Dylan McNeill, SDG Pioneer from 2019, driving sustainability at Royal Philips. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Oh, thank you. It's been a great honor. Really appreciate the invite.
You've been listening to Listen Up, a podcast series from the United Nations Global Compact on the young business professionals who are driving sustainability in their companies in order to create a more just, equitable and sustainable world. I'm Dan Thomas, and I'd love to hear from you, our listeners. So please let me know what you think by writing to me at thomas@unglobalcompact.org and tell me who I should talk to next. Goodbye.
You've listened to the United Nations Global Compact podcast. Now it's up to you. Be bold and take action. And don't forget, listen up.